Good afternoon, Andrew McColl from Family Voice for our Zoom session this afternoon. It's our pleasure to have with us Kevin Donnelly, who's a prolific writer. Kevin's a vocal defender of Western civilization and Judeo-Christianity against the destructive and nihilistic impact of neo-Marxist inspired woke ideology. That's a mouthful. He writes regularly for the print and digital media, including The Australian, The Daily Telegraph, The Catholic Weekly, Quadrant, The Australian Spectator, and the London-based Conservative Woman. Kevin also appears regularly on Sky News, and books that he's published include The Dictionary of Woke, Cancel Culture and the Left's Long March, Christianity Matters in These Troubled Times, and How Political Correctness is Destroying Australia. I'll be making reference to his website at the end of our Zoom section this afternoon, and if you want to have a pencil and paper ready to write that down, I'll give it to you then. So, Kevin Donnelly, welcome to our Zoom session this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and looking forward to being interviewed.
Good. Kevin, you've been heavily involved with writing and overseeing curriculum in Australian schools now for decades. What's been happening to Australian school curriculums, say, over the last 30 years?
Yeah, it's a very long story, as you'd expect. But I know when I did matriculation, we called it back then, in 1969 in Victoria, I went on to university during the early 70s and graduated, did a bachelor degree and diploma of education. And I started teaching in 1975. And it was a totally different classroom to what I was used to as a student when I went to school. So during the early 70s, and it happened in England, America and Australia, New Zealand, there was a very significant change in what was happening in school education. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I won't go into all of them. But one of them was that what I call cultural Marxism, or we now talk about being woke or politically correct, instead of education being what I call a liberal education, where teachers would teach, they'd be impartial, objective. The idea was to give young people a grounding in our culture, the knowledge, the skill, the understanding they needed in areas like mathematics or science, history, music. That all changed because of the cultural left. So the idea was that the classroom should be used to overthrow society, to radically change Western culture. So that's where we started to get the move towards gender fluidity, towards multiculturalism, away from the West. So there was this whole movement during the 70s to radically change what was happening in the classroom.
Wow. And okay, so just thinking about curriculum today in Australia, who really controls the writing of our curriculum?
Even though we have a national curriculum, which is was funded by the Commonwealth Government, and I co-chaired the review of that in 2014, even though we have a national curriculum, when you look at school education, the federal government doesn't control it. So it really is up to the states and territories around Australia as to what happens in the classroom in terms of each state and territory will make its own decision. Now, they refer to the national curriculum, and there was a lot of controversy and debate about that when it was implemented, but the final control will go to Victoria or New South Wales or the ACT. They have curriculum bodies that will decide what that particular state or territory would do. The problem is It's really what an economist friend of mine calls provider capture. The people who write the curriculum are subject associations, academics, professional bodies. They have a very strong view on what should be in the curriculum. And as many of your viewers would know, the debates we've been having, where in history, for example, young people are taught that the First Fleet in 1788 was an invasion leading to genocide. So the problem we face in schools around Australia is that the people who are writing the curriculum at that state and territory level, also the Commonwealth level, they're very much promoting in history a black armband view, which is very negative. And that's even coming now into literature and other subjects as well.
Okay. So would you say that Julia Gillard's national curriculum was a good idea, or was it really counterproductive?
I'd go for the second one. And as I mentioned, I co-chaired the review of the national curriculum. And my background is a teacher, classroom teacher for 18 years. And I went back and did postgraduate degrees, a master's and a PhD, looking at curriculum around the world, not just Australia. And so from my point of view, as a curriculum expert, it was a mistake, because I'm a great believer in schools having more control at the local level, what some call subsidiarity, that rather than having a top-down, one-size-fits-all approach mandated by government, I argue schools should have greater freedom and flexibility, because the problem in Australia is, as I said, the people writing the curriculum are very much centre-left. They don't respect Christianity. They don't respect our Western culture. They really are quite radical in what they want to achieve.
So if I'm a parent of school-age children, and my children obviously are much older now, but if I was to go to my local school and say, hey, Mr. Principal, I'm not happy with this textbook that you're using. I think it's unsuitable. I don't like this black armband story about the First Fleet and Captain Phillip or whatever. I don't like the fact that you've got this curriculum that I find deeply upsetting. And I tell him that to his face. What's he going to say to me?
He'll probably say, and I had a niece who went to her local primary school where her two sons were going. And at the school, they had a drag queen come into the classroom and teach radical gender theory, teaching that boys can be girls, girls can be boys. She went up to the principal and said, I don't want this. It's against my faith, against what I believe. He said, oh, I'm sorry. I have to teach it. It's part of the government mandated curriculum. And so it's very hard for parents to actually find a school where the principal or the teachers have the courage to stand up for what the parents might think is right, what they want for their children.
Okay, so from what you're saying, Kevin, there's basically a sort of a stacked deck against the Christian faith in the public system, the family, morality, and that stacked deck is towards humanism, feminism, the LGBT agenda, even transgender and other things. That's how it is it?
You're dead right. And I've been writing about this, as others have been, for many years now. But in that cancel culture book I've mentioned, the first chapter talks about the long march through the institutions. And basically, that's what's happened over the last 30, 40 years in schools and universities. So the cultural left, as I call it, have taken control of the curriculum, what's happening in schools, also teacher training and what young people learn at university. So it is a challenge for parents who are committed to whether they're Jewish or Christian or Islamic. It's difficult for parents of a particular religious faith. Even parents who are more secular, parents who believe that teaching should not be about indoctrination, that their children should not be indoctrinated. It's very difficult now for those parents to find a solution, and we might talk about it. A lot of parents increasingly are homeschooling, and I've also been involved with a number of schools around Australia being set up by parents and teachers to establish their own independent schools, not part of the government system.
Okay, so you're saying that the public system is very closely controlled by these agendas, and the education department does employ people. So because they employ that public school teacher, he or she knows that someone's paying his wages every fortnight, and if he wants to differ or argue with his department, that's fine, but he's probably going to have to leave. So the public system is essentially, you know, set in concrete, and it will not change unless someone comes along and blows it up, and there's some major activity to direct the department to do something else with what they're telling people to do. So you kind of alluded to the idea of possible homeschooling. Is that the only option then to kind of break entirely with the standard bricks and mortar school?
That certainly is one option, and increasingly I'm hearing of parents who have taken that decision, and it is difficult, obviously, takes a lot of expertise and time, but parents increasingly are taking that option. Probably a better one, and I was involved in organising a seminar at Campion College, which is a liberal arts college in Sydney 2 weeks ago, of about 70 people and teachers from around Australia and academics. The second option, apart from homeschooling, is for these people who are establishing or have already established their own schools. And many of these are Christian schools, whether they're Catholic or Pentecostal, they're Christian schools. And what those parents and teachers are doing, with help from business people who are often willing to put in the money, they're establishing their own schools where they're able to employ their own staff. And that means you can employ staff who agree with and who understand and acknowledge what the school is trying to do. You can employ your own staff, and you can have a particular curriculum focus. So as long as you touch on the national curriculum or what the state or territory equivalent is, as long as you include that to a degree, you still have the flexibility to focus on what you think is important. And many of the parents and teachers I met in Sydney 2 weeks ago, they're very much wanting to do what's called a classical education, which is more about going back to the ancient Greeks, the Romans, more about theology, philosophy, the great books of literature, more about Western culture, Western civilization. So I think that's very worthwhile. The third option, and it's happened in America, in Florida and Virginia, those two states, and it's a little bit different in America because parents have greater control over their local schools, is that parents are organising and active and actually changing the board, the school board, to ensure that it's teaching what they want to teach.
Okay, so one question that sort of flows from that, Kevin, is for these schools that are much more independent, do they find themselves in a difficult place if they put their hand up for some government funding and the department looks at things and says, well, why aren't you teaching Darwinism and the woke agenda, etc.?
That's a possibility, and that's made worse by the fact that, as we all know, that increasingly it's whether it's government or even the Australian Education Union, various professional bodies, there's almost a campaign now to cancel Christianity and to cancel religion from schools, from the curriculum. I mean, one example was City Point, the Christian college in Brisbane, where I think it was last year the principal was pressured to resign because on the enrolment form that parents signed up to, it said that students would be a boy or a girl, and the argument was from the what I call radical secular people, these cultural Marxists. The argument was, well, that's unfair, that's binary, that's heteronormative. A student can be anywhere on the LGBTQI plus scale. So students can self-identify as trans or whatever it might be, and the school cannot say no to that. And as we know, it hasn't been decided yet, but the federal government is looking into changing the religious freedom legislation. And there's a real worry that these religious schools or faith-based schools, when it comes to who they employ, who they enrol, even their curriculum, that they'll be forced to adopt a very radical secular agenda. But I'd argue what should be happening is parents should be fighting against that, and they should be getting on to their local member of parliament, or they should organise, put in submissions and argue the case that parents are the primary educators of their children and their moral guardians. So you're right, increasingly it is difficult for independent schools, if they're religious, to fight against this. And I argue we must continue to fight.
Right, okay. Because I have noticed within Christian schools over the years, in my experience, also as a teacher, that there was the desire for a Christian curriculum there, for sure. But over the last, I guess I'd say 15 or 20 years, there's been increasing pressure for the school to be inspected on a pretty regular basis, and anything that doesn't comply with the agendas that we've talked about, the secularism, the humanism, etc., they're likely to say, hey, Mr. Principal, you've got this in your school, you've got this part of your curriculum, we're considering giving you taking out your funding. And if you're looking at an established school with 30, 40, 50 teachers with the science blocks and the school labs and the swimming pools and all of the other things that are expected to be had in schools today, they find themselves pretty much over a barrel. They want the funding. They think the school needs the government funding, which often provides 80% of the funding for the school. And so they kind of go, oh, well, this is a problem. And the danger is in that context that they're likely to say, well, the funding is essential. So we will actually go easy on this 6-day creation, et cetera, because the bottom line is we want that money.
I mean, that's very true. And there's no easy solution to that. There's no easy answer. Bob Santa Maria, who I got to know very well many years ago, he always said to me, if you sup with the devil, eat with a long spoon. So the reality is, if you take government money, then in a way you're beholden to government. But I'd suggest that the curriculum is flexible to a degree, and that if you have school leaders and teachers who are careful, there's a way to balance all of that so that you can get the funding while still remaining true to your mission as a school. But it is a balancing act. And as we found with City Point, if it's obvious that you're arguing the case in this example with enrolments, then you can get into trouble. But I think it's a worthwhile struggle to get into, because more and more parents, from my experience, are aware of the dangers of this, say, gender fluidity, for example, this cultural Marxist view that boys can be girls and girls can be boys, more and more parents are organising against it. So I think there are some issues here where parents and schools should stand up and fight the good fight.
Yeah, okay. So these are the things that we just going back to what we've been talking about, the educational curriculum, the stack deck of things. So you're saying that the parent, the conservative or the Christian parent who wants to send their children to a private school should lobby their local member about that rather than just put up with what they've got are supposed to do.
Sure, and I know it is very difficult. Not everybody has the luxury, but I spoke about my niece before, and I've spoken to other parents. What they do is move their child to a school that they find better suits what they believe in terms of a parent, the values and morals that they hold on to. Now, if you're in a place like Melbourne or Sydney or one of the larger cities, it's easier to do that. I mean, in Melbourne, for example, there are 3 or 4 Christian schools, classical schools, that are already running or are being established. So we're lucky enough to have the option, but some parents don't have that option. And then again, maybe for them it's homeschooling.
Yeah. So what have you been able to identify yourself in terms of homeschooling curriculums around the place, Kevin?
It's, I mean, if I go back 10 or 15 years, a lot of it was coming out of America,
Yep.
which stood, I mean, that stood to reason, given that really you've probably got hundreds of thousands, if not a million parents who are doing that. You get that critical mass in America. Since COVID, when a lot more parents saw what was happening in the classroom at home and what work their children were doing, there has been a bit of an explosion in homeschooling around Australia,
Yes.
especially Queensland, I understand. And there are a number of homeschooling websites that have started in Australia dedicated to giving a more Australian focus on homeschooling.
Yeah.
And the good thing, well, whether it's a bad thing in a way, a lot of teachers, because they refused to get vaccinated during COVID, lost their jobs and they were out of work. Now, a number of these teachers are actually now working online to provide the resources for homeschooling. So I think it's something that will only increase and will benefit parents and students with a curriculum for homeschooling that has a more Australian focus.
Yeah. Well, we chose to homeschool our own children 33 years ago now, and we were able to access a pretty good curriculum that we used pretty much most of the way through. And since that time with the internet, there are a large number of providers of curriculum around, so that the price of curriculum is coming down steadily almost every year. And whether we go online or whether we go to hard copy, they're certainly out there. And there are places like Khan curriculum, that's spelled KHAN curriculum, which are online and they're free. So that's certainly one source for people who are looking elsewhere to go and find some other things. And as you're pointing out correctly, there are a large number now of Australian families moving rapidly towards homeschooling. And as you also indicated, COVID started that because they suddenly needed to find forms of education for their children that weren't involving travelling to school. So there was a great jump in the numbers at that time. And I think a large number of those have actually stayed in homeschooling.
You're right. And the other thing I should mention is I organised this conference in Sydney at Campion a couple of weeks ago, and some of the people there who are teachers have started the Australian Classical Education Society, and they have a webpage now where they're beginning to offer advice to parents and offer resources related to a classical education within a Christian tradition. So there's more and more happening online.
Good, good. So just going back to you, Peter, for a moment, just thinking about any questions that we may find are coming in from our viewers. Do you have any coming in yet?
Yes, Andrew, that we've got. We have some questions that have come in, so I'll put those to Kevin. Kevin, the first one is, in Victoria, even private schools are very monitored, and you probably won't even get registered. Do you think there is another educational model?
Ideally, I'd follow what's happening overseas. I mean, in America, they call them charter schools. In England, city academies or free schools. But, and even in New Zealand, community schools, there is a movement internationally to actually allow schools to have what I mentioned, subsidiarity. So these schools are able to employ their own staff. They're able to set their own curriculum focus. They're able to set their own mission, if you like. And in some American states, they have gone as far as having school vouchers. So a parent would get, say, hypothetically, a voucher for $5,000 or $10,000. They can use that to send their child to whatever school they want. So if you give schools greater autonomy and flexibility, like charter schools in America or free schools in England, and if you give parents a voucher, then there's a lot more flexibility within the system. So it's not just all government or independent schools running the same curriculum, employing the same staff. So I believe ideally that is what should happen in Australia. Now, we haven't got there yet, but there is, as I said, increasing pressure from parents and some teachers to set up their own independent schools, drawing on a classical tradition, generally within a Christian heritage. So that's happening, whether it's Brisbane, Melbourne, Sydney, Perth, whether it's Narre Warren in Melbourne, Wagga in New South Wales. There are a lot more of these schools. The issue will always be the tension between having that autonomy and having what can be an antagonistic government trying to control what you're doing. Now, unfortunately, unless you're wealthy enough to actually finance your own school and not take any money, then you're going to face that problem.
Kevin, you mentioned vouchers there. What is your view on the voucher system? Do you think that's a good way forward, where parents get a voucher and can spend those educational dollars that have been allocated from the taxpayer on where they think is important for their children's education?
The short answer is yes, and I mentioned that in the previous response to the previous question. It's happening in a number of states in America, and it's growing. So the idea is, as I mentioned, parents would get a voucher. They would then send their child to whatever school they think best suits their needs. In a funny way, we have a de facto voucher system in Australia. I live in Melbourne. I'm fortunate that there are 4 or 5 Catholic and independent schools within, say, 5 or 6 kilometres. If I change my daughter, for example, from Genesano to Fintona, an independent girls' school, the money follows her, if you like. So at the moment, independent Catholic schools, government schools are funded by state and Commonwealth territory governments, and they're funded per student. The independent and the Catholic schools, that funding depends on the parents of that school, their financial situation. So if you're going to a privileged, wealthy school like Geelong Grammar in Victoria, you might only get $2,000 from funding, from the government. If you're going to a low fee paying Christian school, you'll get more money. But the point I'm making is we kind of have a de facto system where the money follows the child. And my argument would be, why not formalise that, have a voucher system as they do in America? And that, to me, gets rid of that provider capture, that idea that you have to follow what the government says, what the teacher union says, because if you don't want that particular school, you've got a voucher to find a school that better suits you and your children.
That's very good, Kevin. Thank you. I've got another question here. In the event parents and teachers and big business set up their own school and curriculum without government funding, would the students who apply for university or government positions, will they be accepted as they have not studied in using the woke curriculum?
Increasingly, there are alternatives. And, you know, at the meeting we had in Sydney, I talked about there was some discussion about how to do this. But if you look at Year 12 around Australia, there are the different state and territory Year 12 certificates. In Victoria, where I live, it's the high school certificate. These courses are accredited and registered by the local authorities. But even when you look at the national curriculum, there is the flexibility there to offer something like the International Baccalaureate as an alternative, or the Cambridge A-levels as an alternative. So there is a degree of flexibility in the curriculum. If you're looking at Year 12, then a number of schools, in addition to the high school certificate, are doing the International Baccalaureate or IB. So it's possible, and I hope this happens in the near future, that you might even get an accredited Year 12 based on a classical education. And if it was, I think you'd find universities would be very happy to accept it, because they generally have a more intellectually rigorous education, more intellectually grounded than what they're having with the current system.
Thank you, Kevin. I've got another question here. Can you explain cultural Marxism? What does that mean?
Very good question. If you go back to the 1920s and 1930s, what I call classical Marxism that came out of the Communist Manifesto, for example, Lenin and Engels, Marx and Engels, then put into practice by Lenin and Stalin with the Russian Revolution, and then Mao in China. If you look at that classical Marxism, it's all about overthrowing capitalism by taking control of industry, business, production, and freeing up the workers. What happened during the 20s and 30s is that a lot of these Marxist academics realised that there would never be a revolution in the West, that whether it was Europe or England or America or Australia, the revolution had occurred in Russia, in China, but it was never going to happen in the West. What they decided was, rather than keeping the focus on classical Marxism, they would focus on cultural Marxism, which is about taking the long march through the institutions, taking control of school, universities, churches, trade unions, the media, family. So the idea was you could overthrow capitalism, overthrow the status quo. You could have the so-called socialist utopia, even though we know it's never happened. You could achieve that by taking the long march and taking control of the culture of a society. As I said, education, family, church. And we've seen that the last 40, 50 years, the way universities and schools have been taken over by the cultural left. the way, for example, the ABC rarely, if ever, gives any voice to a conservative. It's all about cultural left ideology. We've seen that the left has been very successful. So cultural Marxism is saying we'll never win the revolution by storming the barricades or taking to the streets. We'll win the revolution by taking control of the institutions.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. It certainly seems like they've been very successful. Given that, what's the best way to defeat this cultural Marxism and try to win back our Christian Western culture?
Well, I think a good way is prayer. And what I mean by that is to acknowledge and respect Christianity, Judeo-Christianity, some call it, but to understand that there is a battle going on, as the late Cardinal Pell knew, George Pell, who argued very strongly that, as Bob Santa Maria did and others, that there is a battle going on between Christianity and this radical secular ideology, which I call cultural Marxism. We have to understand that there is a battle and that we need God's grace to fight this, but we also need to mobilise, to organise like-minded people, kindred souls, if you like. We need to organise, we need to get into the public square, we need to, whether it's writing for newspapers, letters to the editor, whether it's going on radio or TV, we need to organise and be vocal. We need to contact members of parliament and make them know what the issues are and what the concerns are. And we need, as I say, to understand that it's going to be a medium to long-term struggle, that it won't be overnight, and it will take a lot of effort. But I'm reasonably positive after meeting a lot of these parents and teachers in Sydney, because people are lighting small fires around Australia. And there are hundreds, literally hundreds, of low fee paying Christian schools, I think also, that are lighting these small fires and that are giving young people the knowledge and the skill and the ability to go into society and to fight the good fight. That's why we had this seminar at Campion College in Sydney, which was one of Australia's first liberal arts colleges, and their graduates are obviously quite aware of what needs to be done, and they have the knowledge and the skills to do that.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you for your efforts in helping us to win that back again. I've got one last question here. It's a little bit of a curly one. I hope you can understand this. How has A.S. Neil and Abraham Maslow enabled this to happen?
Yeah, when I did the doctorate, I looked at the history of curriculum development, and mainly, well, also Europe, but also England, America, and Australia. Going right back to Rousseau and the idea in Neil, there was this kind of romantic idea that you didn't need schools, you didn't need teachers. Children would grow naturally into knowledge and understanding. Children were like plants. If you put them in the sun and watered them, they would naturally grow towards understanding and knowledge. A.S. Neil had a progressive school in England, Summerhill, and he argued you actually didn't have to teach young kids, primary or secondary. You didn't need to have them in a classroom where there was a teacher at the front teaching history or maths or science. In Melbourne, the school that started like this was Presshill. And what these schools believed was that the child would naturally grow towards knowledge, understanding, as I said. So you don't need teachers to teach the subject. You don't need a sense of discipline like music or literature or physics or science. We see this in a lot of schools at the moment and the curriculum, which is all about self-agency, child-centered learning, where the teacher is a guide by the side. The teachers aren't supposed to be at the front of the room, an authority figure. Students are allowed to, in many cases, follow their own interest as to what they want to learn. And there was a case in Western Australia some years ago where the then education minister said, you don't need teachers, just let the kids go on the internet and they can Google whatever they want and they can learn through the internet, which is rubbish. But it does go back to this idea of this romantic idea that children don't need to be taught. They don't need to be initiated into their culture or to the disciplines, that they can work it out all themselves. And that's obviously a failure. And we see that in Australia over the last 40, 50 years. One reason we're going backwards in international testing, in mathematics, science, literacy, the reason why so many generations of young people have left school culturally illiterate and morally adrift is because we haven't followed the more classical liberal view of education, where teachers take control and students have to master that body of knowledge.
Thank you, Kevin. So I take it that you're saying that doesn't work out very well, just the laissez-faire approach to let the children do what they want. Well, what actually does work the best, Kevin, as far as educational outcomes?
Well, it needs to be a balance. As I mentioned, I taught for 18 years. What I did when I was first introducing a subject was very different to a month later when the students had mastered the basics, if you like. Initially, when the students don't understand or know about it, say teaching poetry, I have to explain to them what a metaphor is, what a simile is. I need to explain to them the importance of alliteration, of rhyme, of meter. So that's very important. After a month, once students have mastered that, then they can be a bit more creative themselves. I can say, give them a poem and ask them to evaluate it, to analyse it. You need different, if I could put it this way, a toolbox of different strategies and skills, ranging from more explicit formal teaching to giving students the flexibility and the creativity to do something of their own choice. Equally the case that there are times when it's the teacher at the front of the room directing the lesson, and there are other times when you can break the class into small groups where they work together. So part of the problem in education the last 40, 50 years is that those in control of the curriculum, or the ministers of education, or the bureaucrats, have often said there's only one solution. There's one magic bullet. Everyone must follow what we tell them to do. I don't believe that's the answer. You need a range of different skills, different approaches.
Well, thank you, Kevin. I think you've answered most of the questions that I've got here. So thank you very much. Over to Andrew.
Thank you, Peter. Well, look, it's been great talking with you, Kevin, and we do appreciate your expertise and your knowledge in your field in education. And for those viewers who'd like to know more about Kevin and what he's written, you can go to his website, which is www.kevindonnelly. That's Kevin, KEVINDONNELLY.com.au. And you'll find his books on there. And the one that he was the editor of fairly recently is called Cancel Culture and the Left's Long March. And that's available on that website for $29. So thanks again, Kevin, for being with us today. We appreciate your help and understanding and look forward to our next Zoom together. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
God bless. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.